Great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I'm very happy to present this, this project here. So this is a paper titled The Effect of Influencer Advertising Disclosure Regulations, Evidence from Instagram. And it's a joint project with my co-author, Matthew Mitchell from the University of Toronto. And so to motivate this project, so we're thinking about these user-generated content social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube that are massively popular. And on these platforms, basically on every single one of these platforms, there are really popular users who have, between thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of followers of people who consume their content. And these really popular users, or also called influencers, this basically recent research suggests that what they post online, the content that they generate, actually can have real-world effects in terms of what people who consume their content do. And because of that, there are substantial concerns about exactly what the content that they're producing is. And in particular, a reason for concern is that these influencers aren't being paid directly by the platform, and they're not being paid by the followers directly, but the way that they make money is basically through advertising. So essentially, they're being paid by some brands or by some services to post content that's related to those brands or services in response for money. And so there's substantial concerns, regulatory concerns because of that, about hidden or deceptive advertising. And there's been a few fairly controversial cases, like in terms of selling, these unregulated diet supplements and other sort of situations like that, where influencers were posting some sort of these ads that were low quality or deceptive in some ways. And in response to that, there's been these regulations that are appearing in many different countries that basically mandate disclosure of any advertising responsive content online. This is basically if you're being paid to produce some sort of a product or to promote a product, you have to put a hashtag ad in that post. Okay. And so this paper really asks the question, what are the effects of these mandatory advertising disclosure regulations on both the behavior, the content production behavior of these influencers, and also on their relationships and their interactions and engagement with their followers? And this is actually a purely open empirical question because there's two completely opposite theoretical perspectives on this. The first one comes from the regulatory agencies who are actually enforcing these regulations. And this really draws on the theory of buyer-seller transactions, where they're basically saying you're introducing these regulations basically introduce more information into the market. So basically followers can now, have more information about what's an ad and what's not an ad. They can not click on ads. And this is going to be strictly well for improving, and it's also going to probably reduce the amount of advertising in these markets. There's also an alternative perspective that comes from a series of recent papers that basically mentions that, if you're distorted, so the compensation channel of these influences is indirect. And if you're distorting this channel, this can either be good or bad. And in particular, there can be a situation where, you're reducing the amount of money that these influencers get per post by disclosing that it's an ad. And as a result, if they have to cover some sort of fixed cost, they can actually increase the amount of advertising in equilibrium. And so you can have this kind of adverse effects from these regulations. And so this is what we're gonna tackle in this project empirically. So in this project, we collected data on Instagram influencers in Germany and Spain. And the nice thing about these two countries is that Germany actually had these mandatory disclosure regulations that are quite strict and that happened in late 2016. And this regulation is exactly what I was mentioning before. It basically says that if you're being paid to produce some sort of content, you have to disclose that it's an ad. Okay. And so for this project, we sampled 100 of the most popular local influencers in both Germany and Spain. And so these are not, international soccer players. They're not, they're not international celebrities. These are really local lifestyle or other types of influencers that are basically the most famous people you've never heard of. They still have hundreds of thousands or millions of followers in these countries. But basically for each one of these influencers, we collect, the full history of their posts. So we observe for each post a number of likes, a number of comments, and the text of the posts. I should mention that we didn't collect any pictures from Instagram. And then we also have a partial history on the number of followers of each one of these influencers. And the idea here is to think about this in a kind of a difference in difference logic, where we're going to look at Germany, at influences in Germany and influences in Spain before and after these regulations come into Germany. And so we're going to look at what these influencers do, the content that they post, and also their interaction with the followers. Okay, so before I dive into our data and the results, let me just give you 2 words on, 1, what sponsored content looks like on Instagram, and 2, how it's regulated. So sponsored content is massively prevalent on Instagram. And the way that it generally works is that if you're a brand that wants to advertise with an influencer, you go to one of there's lots of different independent intermediaries that connect you to these influencers. So you go to one of these intermediaries, you see a list of influencers, and then you run a campaign. And these campaigns can either pay an influencer by post. So you can either make some, $50 per post, $100,000 per post, or you can have alternative contractual, kind of long-term contractual arrangement with these influencers. But the point is that regardless of the contractual structure of these contracts, they generally specify the text. So they say, if you're advertising for Adidas, if you have a contract with Adidas, in your post about Adidas, you have to say, go buy Adidas, or Adidas is great. Okay. And so that's how sponsored content looks like. Now, how is it regulated? It's basically regulated in a very patchwork way throughout Europe. And the reason is that there's a lot of ambiguity about exactly how commercial these influencers are. So the older advertising regulations that apply to other markets don't necessarily apply here. Now, so in Germany, you've actually had these really strict labeling requirements since at least 2016, as I mentioned before. So basically anything that you were paid for and anything that you received a free product, you have to label as an ad. And there's been fines and a number of high-profile cases that have been happening in these markets since at least the middle of 2017. Now, by comparison, in other places like France, Italy, or the US, you have these series of non-binding recommendations to influencers and to brands and some public letters, but no fines or cases. So Germany is really kind of the strictest case here. Okay. So with our data, the first thing that we can think about is exactly what are the effects of these regulations, of these disclosure regulations, on actual disclosure. Because there's even concerns that, if you're telling someone to disclose online, they're not going to do it. So the first thing I'm going to show you is 2 time series. So these are monthly time series of the share of posts that we observe in each country that are disclosed as ads. Okay. And the first, so Germany is in red, Spain is in blue. This goes from 2014 to 2019. The first solid red line is the implementation of regulations in Germany. The second solid red line is the start of fines in Germany to influencers. And so what you see here is that before any regulations in Germany and Spain, you had very little disclosure of advertising. Basically, less than 10% of posts were disclosed as advertising in either Germany or Spain. But then after regulations come in, you start seeing this increase in disclosure in Spain that reaches a peak of about 30% around the end of 2018. So basically, by the end of 2018, you have 30% of posts that are posted by influencers in Spain that are disclosed as ads. Okay. So at the very least, what this graph suggests is that there's an increase in disclosure in Germany. At the same time, you don't see any similar effects in Spain. Okay. But then an increase in disclosure is not the same as an increase in actual sponsorship. So we want to think about, whether there's less or more sponsored content that's being generated, not just sponsored content that's being disclosed. And to do that, we have to think about what does sponsored content looks like when it's not disclosed. So again, we know really well what sponsored and disclosed posts look like because they're actually disclosed, through a hashtag ad or hashtag Werbung in Germany. But we're less sure about what sponsored non-disclosed posts look like. And so to do that, we have 2 methods. And both of these methods use the text of the post. So the first one is just this manual definition using keywords, this manual classification. And basically the idea is that we have some sort of a sense of what sponsored content actually looks like. So for example, it gives you a discount codes. It presents a link to an outside website. It talks about brands. It says stuff like buy this, right? And so the idea is that we have a bunch of these keywords, and then we throw all these keywords at the text of each post, and we see which ones, the keywords appear. And so for the ones that the keywords appear, they're basically going to say that those are sponsored. Okay, so this is the manual definition. The drawback here is that we have to pick our keywords ourselves. So you have to trust us that we know exactly what we're doing and that we pick the right keywords and stuff like that. So we have a second approach that basically uses a supervised machine learning algorithm. And this idea is we're basically going to train an algorithm to look for words that are associated with disclosure. So what this algorithm is going to do is going to find posts that look like disclosed posts, but that don't have disclosure words. And we're going to call those posts the sponsored posts because they look a lot like the sponsored posts that are disclosed. And so we're going to train this algorithm on Germany after regulation, where we observe a lot of disclosure. And then we're going to project this algorithm on pre-regulation Germany and Spain, where we have to kind of translate the Spanish post, obviously. And so again, so we train this naive, so we're currently using a naive Bayes algorithm that's very simple to train and also works quite well. And we're basically doing this as the second step. So there's a few drawbacks here to using these algorithms, like overfitting, the question of what happens with imperfect disclosure, what happens with translation. But basically, both of these actually do a pretty good job of catching the disclosed post, although the machine learning algorithm is more conservative in the sense that it thinks that there's less sponsorship happening in these markets. So let me just show you a picture of what sponsorship looks like in these markets before and after regulation. So this is an analog to the picture I showed you before about disclosure, except that this is using our predicted our labeled sponsored posts. So this shows you the percentage of sponsored posts, of posts that we label as sponsored, as a share of all posts in the market that we observe in every month in our sample from 2015 to 2019. And so the interesting thing that I want to show you is that either using the naive Bayes, which is here, or the manually predicted sponsored share, we find that despite the fact that in Spain there's very little disclosure happening of sponsorship, there's actually more, our algorithms uncover more sponsorship than in Germany. So the blue line here, that's the per share of sponsored content in Spain, is above the share of sponsored content in Germany. And then the second thing is that our algorithm suggests that there's an increase in sponsorship in Germany that happens right after the period of the regulations. So again, this suggests that there's an increase in sponsorship, not just of disclosure, but of the amount of sponsored content that's happening in Germany after the mandatory disclosure regulations come in. Okay. So again, I think these two pictures show this in a pretty nice way. But what we want to do is we want to think about this in kind of a more robust sense and think about this in a regression framework where you control for lots of other stuff. Okay. So the way that we're going to do this is essentially like a really classic difference in difference setting, where we're going to have an outcome Y. So for example, the share of sponsored posts, and we're going to do this at the influencer month level. So for each influencer, we're going to group all their posts in a month into one observation. And so an observation here is going to be an influencer month. And so we're going to think about the outcome. So the share of sponsored posts as being a function of influencer fixed effects, time fixed effects that are going to absorb everything about these influencers that's constant over time or about the time period, and a bunch of other influencer time varying controls that capture things about the influencer, like account age, and also capture a lot of stuff about the country. So like GDP per capita, Google Trends for Instagram, search intensity in the country, that captures a lot of stuff about like demand shocks for advertising in this market. And then the key variable and parameter here, the key parameter here is this alpha that's associated with this variable that's reg IT that's equal to 1 if influencer I is in Germany after regulation. So this is our difference to difference parameter. And so again, the key identifying assumption here is that things without this regulations look pretty similar in Germany and in Spain. So the pre-trends are parallel. And we can actually test for this by looking at the pre-regulation period, and everything seems to be okay. But so let me show you in the 5 or so minutes that I have left, let me talk a little bit about our actual results. So we have a few interesting outcomes here. So the first outcome is just the share of disclosed posts. So this is the percentage of disclosed posts in this market. So this we're doing just to make sure that our difference to difference estimator is actually capturing stuff correctly. And it seems like it is. So we are capturing this increase in disclosure that's happening in Germany in the treated period after disclosure regulations come in. But then in the next two columns, we look at the share of sponsored content under both the manual approach and the naive Bayes approach. And in both of those cases, so again, these regressions are basically analog to the graphs I showed you before. So in both of these regressions, you basically find there's an increase in the amount of sponsored content that's appearing in Germany after regulation. So for example, in naive Bayes sponsored content, there's an increase of 7.2%. In the share of sponsored posts that are happening relative to a pre-treatment mean of about 19%. So these are substantial effects that are happening in these markets, and an increase in sponsorship. And so these are relative figures, but we've also done this at the absolute level. And this suggests that this increase in sponsorship is happening because there's more sponsored posts that are being generated, rather than a decrease in the total number of posts in the market. Okay. So there's an increase in sponsorship, and then we also look at disclosure. So this is the disclosure rate of our manually predicted sponsored posts or the naive-based predicted sponsored posts. And again, what it suggests is that there's an increase in disclosure, which is basically what you would expect because there's these disclosure regulations come in, but the disclosure is actually far from perfect. So basically, relative to a pre-treatment mean of about 10%, you have an increase of about 25% in the disclosure rate. So basically, on average, something like 40% of sponsored posts are being disclosed in Germany after regulation. So there's still a lot of sponsored content that's not being disclosed here. Okay. And the last thing that we do at these influencer month regressions is look at the number of followers. And so this tries to get at, rather than what the influencers do, it tries to get at what the engagement between influencers and followers. What we find is that there's a statistically significant decrease in the number of followers for influencers in Germany after regulation comes in. So this suggests that there's a dislike of this increased sponsorship in this market. Okay. And we try to dig at this story a little bit more by looking at post-level regressions. So we also run these different type regressions at post level, where we look at the average number of likes per post, conditional on the number of followers, and the average number of comments per post, which is conditional on the number of followers and the number of likes. And again, in both of these sets of regressions, we include influence and time fixed effects and post-level controls. And what we find is that the number of likes falls in Germany after regulation come in. And we also find that the number of comments actually increases conditional on the number of followers and the number of likes. And at first we were really surprised by that second result. But then when we thought about it, and actually Instagram doesn't have this like dislike button. And so if you dislike some post, the only way to express this is by putting in a comment. So these two results are actually consistent, and they actually are driven by non-disclosed sponsored posts. So this suggests that there's kind of this growing dislike of non-disclosed sponsored content in Germany after this regulation comes in, and a decreased engagement of the followers with the content. Okay. So these are, I think, the big picture of the results is there's an increase in sponsorship and then a decrease in this engagement. So let me just conclude and give you a few kind of next steps of where we're going with this project. So the conclusion is that we use this new data set, we collect this new data set of influencer activity to look at the effect of advertising disclosure regulations online. And theory suggests that disclosure regulations can actually have these adverse effects where they increase advertising on platforms. And what we find is some evidence consistent with this effect. And so in our data, influencers in Germany increase the amount of advertising they produce after regulations come in. And we also find evidence suggestive of this changing engagement between influencers and followers in Germany. And so we have a few next steps in terms of what we're going to do. We have, so one of the things we're working on right now is improving the classifier. We also have a bigger data set, with 10,000 influencers from Germany and Spain rather than just 100. So we're also starting to look at the content of posts and the heterogeneity of effects in different types of influencers. And then the last thing I want to say is that this is a kind of a multi-paper project that we're thinking about. And we have these like longer, bigger picture goals that probably require some sort of like more intensive modeling in this market. And particularly what we want to think about is counterfactual regulation schemes. So again, Germany is a very extreme example where everything has to be labeled, but there's other regulation schemes that were proposed in theory that are potentially kind of better for these markets. So we want to think about, what's the best regulation scheme for this market. And then we also want to think about welfare here. And the reason I have a question mark, and I'll just conclude on that, is because it's really hard to think about welfare in this market. We have the number of likes that kind of suggests something about user engagement, but again, it's still a kind of an open question. And so, yeah, so let me just conclude here. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for attending and for attending this session.